Pollution is the presence or the introduction into the environment of a substance or a thing that has harmful or poisonous effects. The terminology, it gets in the way of people. And speaking of terminology, if I start being a geek talking gibberish, please stop me. Because if you don't know what I'm talking about, the likelihood that a lot of people don't know what I'm talking about is really high. At the end, we'll have a time for more general questions. And all my talks I've arranged so that I'm going to talk for an order of a half hour, and then it's your turn to ask questions, so we can play question and answer. I figured that was a good use of all of our time that way. I give you some background, but I can't know what's on your mind, and then you can kind of drive it. So while I'm going through my talk today, you can be thinking about questions. So the first is, if you're old enough and can remember back to the 70s, what we're talking about was originally called the greenhouse effect. When I was in school, this is what I learned it was called. And I'm going to go into a little bit of why it was called the greenhouse effect today. And it describes the physics of the problem. In the 80s and the 90s, people decided that it was decided that didn't communicate what the problem was good enough, and they started talking about global warming. And they had two problems with global warming. Was that one, the whole world's not warming, and the second was a lot of other things are changing besides temperature, like sea ice or sea level, and so on. And so then in around the 2000s, it got changed to climate change. Now, climate change includes both human-caused changes to climate and natural changes to climate. One of the natural changes is variability, and variability is just what we all experience. One day is different than the next. And that has to do with interactions in the atmosphere or between the atmosphere and the ocean and sea ice and so on. That's what causes variability. It's been and then there's things like volcanoes. When they go off, they can change the climate for a few years. And an easy way to think about the difference between climate and weather is climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. So Dan gave you some background of who I was. I was born, raised in a Lutheran church, attended Sunday school every Sunday, knew all the stories and about Jesus and so on, went off to college. And then when I went off to college, I had the idea in my head that I was going to eat, drink, and be merry, because when I was living at home, my family was quite strict. I never drank any alcohol, didn't smoke, didn't use any foul language, and so on. And I was going to go to school and do something different. And what I discovered, I started school, I think it was September 25th. And by about October 10th, I was as lonely as I could be. And I was miserable, lonely. And on October 31st, Halloween, a guy from Campus Crusade cornered me. It turned out it was a brother of a good friend of mine. And I went through the 4 spiritual laws, if you have ever known what Campus Crusade was like. And I accepted Christ as my Savior. That guy went away, and I literally never saw him again in my life. And so here I was, a new Christian, didn't know what to do. I knew enough to grab a Bible like JC was talking about. I didn't have to ask anybody. And I started reading. I went through the Gospels, and I knew all those stories. Got into Acts, I knew most of those stories. And I got into Romans and got some of the theology. And it was kind of the first time that had hit me. And as my want, as a scientist, the way I think and how to arrange things, it started hooking all these stories together in a way that made sense to me. And that was my story. So the way I became a meteorologist, and this is as long as I can remember, and from what my parents told me when I was about 4 or 5 years old, I started getting interested in the weather. And so I was always interested in wanting to know how God's creation works. And so I knew from a very early age, I wanted to be either a geologist or a weatherman, or something to do with geoscience. And that's how I ended up going to Penn State. Penn State's, if you don't know, is one of the foremost schools for getting meteorology. It produces about a quarter of all the meteorologists in the United States. And I happen to live in Pennsylvania, so it was a good match. And I ended up, it also determined where I worked and what I worked on for the rest of my career. And I found a job at GFDL, as Dan said, and I ended up working with the world's foremost climate model, or a guy named Suki Manabe, which I'll talk about in a second. And I'm currently at the University of Arizona as an adjunct professor. I'm working with one of my former postdocs that I had when I was at GFDL, so it's a nice synergy. Get to go out to Tucson in the winter. So continuing a little bit of my story. So on the work side of things, I've been a climate scientist for about 45 years or more now. The cachet for a scientist is peer-reviewed papers. I don't know. These are papers, I write a paper, I send it off to a journal. They send it out to my colleagues that are experts in the field, and they review the paper to see if it's worth publishing. Do I make my arguments clear? Is the writing clear? Can you understand it? Is it new science? Am I referencing old science properly? All those kinds of things is what they do. And then I cite other people's work, and other people cite my work. And so how often you're cited in other people's work is actually a very important thing for getting promoted as a scientist. That is the number one thing to get promoted. So that's the cash. My 200 papers that are out there is what makes me famous, in a sense, in my field. I'm a fellow of the American Meteorological Society and the Geophysical Union. They're the two largest geophysics societies in the United States and two of the largest in the world. And I've had as Dan said, I've had JC also mentioned been blessed to be part of 2 Nobel Prizes. One is the Peace Prize. If you remember back when Al Gore won the Peace Prize, he won it with another organization called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That's the IPCC. I was involved in the IPCC from the first one. I've been a chapter author in that. And then 2 years ago, Suki Manabe won the Nobel in Physics, being the first meteorologist in the past 100 years to win a physics prize. I never thought the physicists would give a meteorologist the prize, but it happened, so it's amazing. And I've been a lead author of many national and international climate reports. A little bit, again, going background, contrary to what you might have heard or understand, Earth scientists, there's a large fraction, actually larger than the population at large, that have a strong faith as Christians. And I took part in a survey in, I think it was 1988. And that survey found that about a third of all Earth scientists had a very strong faith in Christians. And the way they were as Christians, and the way they were defining that is they attended church regularly. They were active in committees, and as part of the church, they regularly prayed things and did the things that you would think of as being a Christian. And as I've been out among and have interactions with the various scientists, climate scientists that I've run into, that jives with my experience. I would say about a third of them have very strong faith. And so it's the physicists and the chemists that are all the heathens. Whoops. Oh, it went. So looking at a little bit of our faith and why we should take care of the earth. The verse that I have heard the most used when this is being discussed goes back to the Garden of Eden. And in Genesis 1, verse 26, it says, "And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." And the key in that is, what does the word dominion mean? The dictionary says that dominion means to have sovereignty or control, or that it's a territory that's part of a country or a government. And they're both similar. Both these meanings are similar in that it's a chunk of property that's under control of another entity. So my interpretation of that is that God gave us humans the right to tend other living things for God. That would be my summary. So then how's dominion been historically interpreted? In the 1800s and continuing to this day, there's a lot of Christians that interpret dominion as meaning that humans can do whatever they want to do here on the earth, and it's there for them to use. And a second viewpoint, which is becoming more popular, is that we must take care of the earth, that we're responsible to God for our actions in caring for the earth. And you see the difference between the two. The top one has been particularly used by Americans back in the 1800s and the early 1900s to take over all of North America, or all the United States certainly, and to mine oil and gas and whatever they want to do and other minerals that are needed, and that you can just do what you want to do. The second one is much more nuanced than that there's trade-offs, things that are beneficial for humans, but that we can use, but is it going to harm the earth? So now moving on to a little bit of the history of climate change. So when did it start? So humans originally were in small groups, basically following herds of animals around. And when farming started about 10,000 years ago, people starting to cut down forests and settle on plots of land. Now, the cutting down of the forests in itself doesn't add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, but the burning of the trees do. And also the tilling of soil also releases carbon into the air. And so those two things started increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, and you can actually see that in records that we'll see next week. The third thing that happened as humans started settling in one spot is that they then had a trouble with waste management, that both human and animal waste polluted the water and releases. Now I'm going to be using shorthand all over the place for chemicals. CO2 is carbon dioxide. This is methane, CH4. They both happen to be greenhouse gases. And I'll tell you what that means in a second. Now, the big changes where humans really started to impact the amount of carbon in the atmosphere occurred with the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, which was something like 1750, and the burning of fossil fuels. And what fossil fuels are it's oil and gas that were made from animals that lived millions of years ago and then got buried. So the atmosphere didn't see that carbon anymore. And humans are now digging, are pumping that stuff out of the ground and burning it. And that burning produces carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, along with other stuff. The thing that a lot of people don't realize is that when you burn oil and gas, a lot of what's produced produces warming, but also some of it produces cooling, which makes life a lot more interesting for us climate scientists. Now, why is it called greenhouse? Why was it originally called greenhouse gases? Why are they called that? Looking at the picture over here on the right, if you think of the Earth and put a box around it, in order for the Earth to have a constant temperature, the amount of energy coming into the box has to equal the amount of energy going out of the box. So now the yellow line you can think of as sunshine coming into the Earth. The atmosphere is transparent to, basically transparent to that. And so the only part that gets reflected back out to space is the stuff that either hits clouds or that hits sea ice. That's stuff that's white and reflected. So that's what heats the Earth. Now, how does the Earth get rid of the energy back out to space? It's a physical law that everything that has a temperature radiates. You're radiating right now. I'm radiating the trees, the building. Anything that has a temperature radiates. And that radiation of the Earth with the temperature that it's at is happening in the infrared wavelengths. And so if you, that's how infrared cameras work. They take, you can see stuff in those wavelengths. And the reason it's called greenhouse gases is just like a greenhouse, the glass is basically transparent to the visible sunlight, and it interfered with the energy going back out. Greenhouse gases are invisible to the sunlight, so the sunlight can pass straight through them. It hits the surface of the Earth and warms it. But as the energy is going back out, the greenhouse gases intercept it and re-radiate it. And they radiate in both directions. They radiate up and down. So they return some of the energy back down towards the surface. And now you can start to see if humans start throwing more greenhouse gases in the Earth, they reduce what gets out to space. So the Earth has to heat up in order to make that balance work again. So that's the physics of the problem. So some of the greenhouse gases are water vapor is the #1 greenhouse gas. And the reason it's not a problem per se is that the climate itself controls, on short timescales like days, controls how much water vapor is in the air. Humans can't impact that very much. We can put all the water vapor we want into the air. It'll fall back out pretty fast as rain. Carbon dioxide is the second most important greenhouse gas. And the reason it's important, the second most important, is that it has very long lifetimes. The carbon that's coming out your mouth or nose right now as you're breathing, what came out of your tailpipe in your car to get here will still be around 100 years. A large fraction of it will still be around 100 years from now. And even about a third of it will still be around 1,000 years from now. And so it will be heating the earth for a very long time, which is why it's the second most important one. Methane has a much shorter lifetime than carbon dioxide. It only lasts for about 10 years. It has a much larger heating potential. It intercepts a lot more of that energy that's coming up from the earth than the carbon dioxide does. But it only lasts for about 10 years. Then unfortunately, what it turns into is carbon dioxide and water. The water falls out and the carbon sticks around for a long time. And then there's a whole bunch of nitrous oxides, various ones. I just put one of them up here. There's a whole family of them. So these are all the ones that are kind of what I would call, they're natural and they're man-made. Both occur naturally. There's some greenhouse gases that are only man-made. Again, those of you old enough can remember the refrigerants called freons. Those things have very long lifetimes again in the atmosphere, and they're a greenhouse gas. They were replaced where they put a hydrogen atom in that molecule, and that has a shorter lifetime, but they have an even greater warming potential for the short lifetime that they're around. So humans make stuff that goes out into the atmosphere that's not natural, and also cause warming. The greenhouse gases are naturally caused by volcanoes. Volcanoes emit water vapor, carbon dioxide, and all sorts of other chemicals. Vegetation, when it decomposes, releases methane and carbon dioxide. Forest fires release carbon dioxide and methane. Swamp gas is methane. And then, of course, human activities. Anything you burn just about produces carbon dioxide. There's only one thing really that's commonly burnt that doesn't produce carbon dioxide, and that's hydrogen. Because when you burn hydrogen, all you get's water. So how do you deal with pollution? And one of those little ditties again is dilution is the solution to pollution. And this is one of those things where I never thought about this until I started working with people that deal with ocean biogeochemistry. And it took me a little bit to think about this. And it's really true that humans rely on dilution as their solution almost all the time. And so it works really well if the pollution is made up of something natural, meaning that it then can be eaten by some little critters like bacteria or whatever, can change it into some other forms, and it goes away eventually. Meaning it's not man-made. So, and it also works well if there's lots of pollution-free areas around your source of pollution, so you can dilute it easily. Because if the whole area is polluted, then you can mix all the stuff up you want. You're just mixing pollution with pollution. So it doesn't work well if the material is not biodegradable. So stuff like plastics in general aren't biodegradable. There are some plastics that are. There's a lot that's not. There's a whole boatload of forever chemicals that are basically not biodegradable. Once you make them, they're here forever, just about. And it's been in the news recently that New Jersey's changing its rules for how much of those forever chemicals are in our water. And a lot of towns, my daughter lives down in Burlington, and her water doesn't pass. They have city water, and it doesn't pass the state mandates anymore. because they have too many forever chemicals in it. So they had to install a filtration system in their house to filter the water so they could drink it safely. And they have two little kids, and they were really worried about what it was going to do to the little kids. And all of us, it's well known that we have a lot of plastic in us now. Since there's plastics in the ocean, they break down into itty bitty little parts. The fish eat them, and then we eat the fish and get the plastic stuck in them. So, and then if the pollution's long-lived, and carbon dioxide is the classic example of that, it doesn't work well either. You can dilute it all you want, it's still hanging around. So, how well are we tending to God's creation? So we have a really large number of people living on the earth today. This is one of those things where being a POCA charter member person, meaning I'm a person of a certain age, when I was in school, there were 2 million people in the United States, and there was a little over 1 billion people on the planet. And right now, there is something like 450 million people in the United States, and there's something like 8 billion, I think, more or less, on the earth. That we're actually been in this situation now for a while where there's more people currently alive than have ever died, which seems like, to me, it's like, how can that be? But it's because our population is growing so fast. It's really, really going up. So, and the reason population is such a big problem is if you think about trying to reduce the amount of carbon, because the atmosphere doesn't care if you're improving your carbon emissions. All it cares about is the total carbon emissions. This whole problem is the total carbon emissions. So if you have, 10 people and they're emitting 10 units of carbon, and then 10 years from now, you have 20 people and you've halved their carbon emissions to 5, you have the same problem. You haven't done anything, even though you've done a lot of work to reduce the amount of carbon emitted per people. So population's a real big player in this problem. It's becoming harder and harder for dilution to solve our pollution problems in general. India has a problem called, the pollution coming off of India, there's something called a brown cloud. And years ago, that brown cloud, basically, this was a little cloud over, you could think of the tip of India. In the summertime, you get this, you could actually see it in satellite pictures. It's stuff that's being burnt and staying in the atmosphere. You could see the pollution. Well, over the years, that brown cloud is now big enough that it's extending almost all the way over to Indonesia, and stuff from Southeast Asia is being included in that brown cloud. And so like I said, it's getting harder and harder to get dilution to be the solution to our pollution. And all these things, of course, is leading to many problems about climate change, water scarcity, energy, and so on. I put this slide in to remind you that very shortly, I'm going to ask for questions. And I want you to be thinking about the questions. So websites that you could go to for more information. I just picked out a few. These are my favorites. I don't endorse them. I'm not getting any money from them. But the realclimate.org one was started by climate scientists, 2 guys that I'm pretty good friends with. I've written a few articles that appear on there. it's an enormously big website. I have now find it hard to find the stuff that I'm interested in, but there's information on the basic info about what causes climate change and so on. There's basic info, what things that need to happen to fix it, and all sorts of stuff. There's also another section that talks about the topics of the day. You know, if you read a story in the paper or read a story online about, I don't know, saw on CNN this morning, there's a lake out in California that had gone dry and they made it into agricultural fields that they're now, with all the rain and snow this past winter, the lake's back. And they don't know what to do. And so they'll have something on that, almost guaranteed. People were talking about, is this summer season, this hurricane season, going to be bad or not? Why is it going to be, or why not? They'll have discussions about that on that website. So it's all the topics, like I said, topic day. There's lots of info. It's all produced by climate scientists. There's also another good website if you're interested in looking at pretty pictures and good pictures of stuff that NASA has. When I give talks, that's my go-to place to look for pictures, even science talks, not just public talks, but science talks about stuff. And the last one is the EPA has a really good website for teaching tools, teaching people of all ages, from little folks up to big folks and everybody in between. So I'm going to leave this slide up. This is what the things we're going to be talking about. But now it's your turn to ask questions.
I like hearing questions when I'm virtual, so I'm going to hand the mic around.
I have a question. So you had said that we've increased the amount of people in the world and we've decreased emissions. So basically we haven't made any change.
It's actually worse than that. In reality, what's happened, that was my example. The reality is that that depending on how you view the COVID years, emissions were going up and up and up. And then COVID, actually, they came down a little. But now post-COVID, they've jumped again. So the question is, are they going to stay flat? Are they going to jump, keep going up and up and up? And the answer to those questions aren't known. And the thing that's hardest, you know, a bottom line kicker, in order to stabilize the CO2 concentration, because it has a long-lived gas, it's such a long-lived gas, you have to get the emissions down to about zero. So we haven't even turned, we collectively, your people on the earth, haven't turned that curve over yet to start going down. We have turned over the amount of emissions per person. So that's started down. But we haven't yet turned the emissions curve over from a scientific point of view where you can say, yes, it's definitely going down.
So my question is kind of along the lines of what you said. So you mentioned that plastics and forever materials are part of the problem. You also mentioned that cutting down trees are part of the problem. So if as a collective humanity, we're trying to reduce plastics by replacing them with papers, aren't we essentially just creating an even worse problem?
So what you're going into is that this problem is not going to be easy to solve. There are all sorts of trade-offs. You know, for years, we, again, collectively in the United States at least, were going from washing dishes by hand to washing dishes in a dishwasher, which actually does save energy and money. And that's a good thing. And then we started going towards replacing eating off dishes would replace eating off paper plates, which unfortunately we then use and chuck back out. Well, then we cut down trees to make those paper plates. And so this is part of that thing. And there's been very few, if any, holistic studies that I know of where people have looked at the amount of carbon dioxide or energy used from end to end of anything. You know, whether it be vegetables that you eat or plastics that you're using or things like that. It's remarkably hard because of all the variables to do those kinds of studies. And they're only, I know a few being done now, but I obviously don't have any results from any of them. And there's some surprising ones for me, at least. I quit eating apples, gala apples, because they come from far away. They get shipped, a lot of them, and especially in the wintertime. And it turns out that the amount of energy used to grow them and ship them to the store where I buy them is not dissimilar to the amount of energy used to grow an apple, the same apple in an orchard here, and stick it in a refrigerator and refrigerate it for that long and then eat it. And so that surprised me to no end. I would have guessed those trade-offs would be that way. That's not going to be true in general, guarantee that, but that's one example of a study that I've heard that was end to end.
Jeff?
So Ron, would you explain to us how the warming of the ocean affects the weather and the climate in terms of storms and typhoons and that sort of damaging weather?
So you can think of it, the simplest way to think of it is, as things warm, there's just more energy around available. And so the warmer the sea surface gets, the more energy there is when the water evaporates. It's at a warmer temperature in the air. The warmer the air is, the more water it can hold. It's not linear. It's a nonlinear process. Nonlinear means that instead of, if you double the temperature of the water, the amount of water vapor that can be in the atmosphere isn't doubled. It's actually double plus a little bit. And water vapor is the key to the process. The heat that's released when you go from water vapor to water liquid is a lot of heat. It's 600 calories per cubic centimeter, to get geeky. and so as you get more and more water vapor, you can get more and more of those 600 calories when you make a cloud. And so that generates more and more energy, which the storms is directly what causes the storms to grow stronger and stronger. So there's a direct tie between how much energy, how much warmth there is in the ocean to then how much of that energy gets back into the atmosphere and then how the atmosphere uses it. That make any sense?
Since today's topic is faith and science, I wanted to ask, do you have days when you think, be anxious for nothing, God will take care of us, the lilies of the field, all that? Because as a scientist and knowing what you know about how difficult these problems are, if you were a betting person, you'd say, okay, we're doomed. Truthfully, and we're not afraid to die, and there will be an end of days. Do you think only as a scientist of solving this problem, or do you have another sort of feeling about it based on your faith?
Good question. Not a simple answer. So I'm going to split this question up into a bunch of things. The first one would be my science, where I was an expert, right, or where I am an expert, is in trying to understand the physics of climate change. I am not an expert in how to make it better. I'm not sure anybody is, but I'm definitely, that's not where I wrote those 200 papers that I was talking about. I was more in where Jeff's question was, which is in some way made it harder to answer. But but obviously I do worry, and being part of these things like the IPCC is you need to, the whole reason for the IPCC is to write a summary document for countries and for the leaders of those countries to read and understand what's going on, so that they can then go into another negotiation, which is you hear about in the news occasionally. It's the FCC, it's the Framework for Climate. Don't know what the C is, convention, maybe. It's a political process where they're trying to reduce the emissions in a way that's fair to everybody. And so in the IPCC, you do think about what's fair and how can you achieve all of this. When you say we're doomed, or to use that kind of language, climate change itself will make it harder for humans to survive. And the Earth may not be able to sustain as many humans as is now alive, but it wouldn't eliminate the human race by itself. I mean, it's never going to get that warm. There's not enough carbon for us to burn to get there. In fact, remind me to come back to that. There's not enough carbon to burn, because that's an important thing that people don't realize. But there are going to be, and there already are, wars. The war in Syria, to a first order, is a climate war, because they're in the middle of a drought that's being caused by climate change to a high degree of certainty, and there's no water. And so people are moving. And when people move, that causes problems for the people where you're leaving from and where you're going to. So it's on both sides. And so those kinds of things are already starting to happen. And so, who's to know what crazy things we could do to each other to make our own doom. But climate change itself won't be the cause of the deaths. It'll be rockets and atomic bombs and things like that. So, that's a question my brother-in-law asked me many years ago. And I said, no, climate warming itself won't cause. Now, there are temperature limits on how warm it can get and humans survive. And there are places on this planet that will become uninhabitable if we keep on our current trajectory. You won't be able to be outside for long periods of time. Singapore is already in that condition. There's places in India in the summertime that are in that condition today. And so there'll be more and more. There'll be places in Florida, if we stay on the high emission trajectories, and by the end of this century, that you won't be able to be outside in the summertime and live. On the other thing that I said about how much carbon's available, I don't know if you appreciate it or not, but without fracking, the United States, the world would be running out of oil pretty strongly right now. We'd be in a very different world if it wouldn't be for fracking. And the fracking bubble in oil is, people argue about whether it's we've hit peak and are past peak, or we're about ready to hit peak in the next 2 or 3 years. But somewhere around now, it's going to be peak oil. And after that, oil's going to start getting very expensive. So that's not well known. But it's one of those things that it's easily seen in the data. Any other questions?
What was it that, but why did COVID reduce? Why did we get on the plane? What was it? The deaths? Was it staying inside?
No, it wasn't deaths. The deaths were, yeah, that's a drop in the bucket. But
so what things is because we stayed inside?
no, it's because of we didn't travel as much. So there's a lot less moving around of people. But the big thing was industry used less energy. I mean, a lot of the carbon that gets burnt, a lot of the energy that gets produced is used by industry. And so, and with the advent of computing and networking and whatnot, computers don't use much power. So that having people stay home was a big win from a CO2 perspective.
Hi, I'm Robin. I was a member of your generation, I think. I was teaching environmental science in high school in 1980, and that's what I remember as being a crisis. But the people, I think, and I don't have statistics on this, really rallied around the cause. They turned their heating and air conditioning down. They wore sweaters. They really started modifying their behavior. As a professor today, do you see the next generation willing to do that?
Well, I think the reason people did that was because of the gas shocks that occurred at the same time. The price of gas went from 25 cents a gallon to a couple dollars a gallon in a few months. As somebody that was going to Penn State and lived in Levittown, I knew I was driving a car that got 15 miles a gallon. I knew when that price jump was a lot less trips home. So, but yeah, I mean, if you're talking about, there's been many opportunities missed for us. I mean, again, if you go back to that same age, cars got a lot smaller and got a lot more fuel efficient. And there was a huge amount of engineering development on car engines. They became a lot more efficient, remarkably more efficient. The engines in our cars today are probably 3 or 4 times as efficient as what those engines were back then. How do we use that increased efficiency? Well, we all bought bigger cars. The dawn of the SUV occurred, and we all had people movers. And so it was, how did we use that efficiency improvement?
So I'm Simone, and I noticed that in recent years, a lot of electric cars have been coming out. Tesla and now Kia is starting to have like new electric cars, and hybrid cars have been around for a minute, probably a decade or so, right? And I'm just curious to see whether electric cars are the new way or the better way, because I noticed that one of the man-made ways of making creating greenhouse gases was making electricity, and that's what the electric cars run on. to get charged and whatnot. So is that
Right.
really the better way, or should we do hybrid cars, or gas is still, because I know gas is only going to get more expensive. So
So the reason there's a push for people to go from internal combustion engines towards electric vehicles is that it makes the problem easier to solve. Obviously, if you're producing electricity via a coal-fired power plant, that's not going to solve anything because you're going to produce, it's almost a 1-for-1 transition of carbon going out a smokestack to carbon going out a tailpipe. But if you can instead produce your energy by solar or wind, then all of a sudden you're not producing any carbon to drive your car. So that's why the push. It makes the bigger problem easier to solve. Unfortunately, in that bigger problem, easier to solve, there's a battery. And the batteries are relying on all sorts of rare earths that are very, very, very rare, hence their name, and expensive. And they're typically not found in places that are friendly to the US. So that's creating problems of a different kind. And the mining of those rare earth things also create pollution themselves. So it's like I said, the problems and the solutions are difficult. It took us 150 years to get into this mess. We're not going to get out of it really fast. People are looking for fast solutions. And I certainly don't see any. Yes.
You said in the very beginning of your talk, you talked about dilution and pollution-free areas. Can you give me an example of what would be a pollution-free area?
Well, the simplest, I'm not sure what you're really asking. In terms of, if you're thinking of a carbon dioxide as the pollutant, I mean, is that what you're?
A bunch of things.
I mean, if you have, so if you're burning leaves in your backyard, it makes a whole lot of smoke. Well, dilution, the way that smoke goes away is that it just dilutes into the atmosphere because there's not, other people aren't burning leaves in all the yards around your backyard. So that's an example of how dilution works, that you can spread it. Another one is, if you all remember the Fukushima power plant, when it got swamped by the tidal wave, and that radioactivity washed out into Fukushima Bay and then out into the Pacific. Well, people thought that that was going to be a huge ecological problem. And for Fukushima Bay, it was. But for the Pacific Ocean, it wasn't. And it's because it got so diluted. That doesn't mean you can't detect some of that radiation in California, which they could a couple of years later when it got over that far for the ocean currents. But it wasn't, basically, yes, you could detect it, but it's because our detectors are so sensitive. It wasn't much different than the natural radiation that was in ocean water. There's a certain amount of natural radiation all around us. So.
Ron, we got one more question, then we do have to wrap up. Anne-Marina's got a question.
You mentioned about where we get our food from, how you were being really conscious about where you got your apple from. And I was thinking about, you hear all these arguments from plant-based eaters that that's the way to go to restore, our, to make a positive change for our environment. And then you hear people on the other side who are meat eaters saying, no, that's a myth. You actually do more damage with deforestation and the rainforest and all of that when you're producing soy and vegetables. I'm just curious what your take is. Do you think that eating more plants versus meat, it makes a difference?
Short answer is yes. vegetarian diets are more energy efficient in general. And the reason is plants. So if you think about energy coming from the sun hitting a plant can absorb something like 15% of that, 20% of that energy. An animal comes along, eats that plant. It's then getting energy from the plant. That's why it eats it. It gets about 15% of its energy from the plant. So now if you just think as an energy flow, so that's 15% of the 15% that came from the sun originally. So if you're eating plants, you're getting 10 times as much energy from the sun as when you eat an animal. Okay? So all other things being equal, you know, transportation and all the other stuff being equal, if you just think about energy flow, eating plants is much more energy efficient than eating animals. Sure.
A lot of the earth is not conducive to plant farming, but is conducive to animal farming. Like my driver's ed teacher said, you have to see the whole big picture.
All right,
Yeah.
we have to wrap up, unfortunately. Gosh, Ron, what do I even say? I thought I was good about my steak. Maybe it was okay to have the steak, maybe not. I felt good about the salmon. Now I'm not sure. The plastic from the salmon. I think I feel good about my Tesla. I'm not even sure after that question. But I'm definitely happy about my solar panels that power my Tesla. How's that, Ron?
Mine too.
Anyway, maybe the most interesting fact I heard was there are more people alive today than ever past, which means technically, I think there are more Christians alive today than have ever passed. So we have an opportunity. Is that fair, Ron?
That's probably true.
All right. Well, hey, I think everyone's pumped about what we heard, and please come back, invite a friend. I can't wait till May 7th when we talk about what do we do about it, right? I'm always, okay, this is nice. What do we do about it? But thanks everyone for being here. Have a blessed week, and thank you very much. Thanks,
Yeah.
Ron. Great
Thank you
job,
all.
Ron. Yeah.